Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Cherno Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we're here with Carleton University's Jennifer Robson, and one of the things that I've noticed is this discussion around the size of the civil service at the end of the Trudeau era. There's this notion that it has somehow grown overly large, but my question is, how do we actually conceive of what is too big, what is not?
Yeah.
I know in 2015, it came at the end of a bunch of cuts from Harper, and I don't know if it was too small at that point, but if people keep using 2015 as a baseline, is that the right thing? Is it not? Jennifer's the right person to ask this. So, yeah, let's start there.
Okay. Thanks again for having me back.
Anytime.
Yeah. How does one measure the size of the public service? Okay, let's start with like why are people focused on 2015? There's nothing magical about 2015. There's no objective measure that says 2015 was somehow like the pinnacle of public service efficiency and right
Right.
sizing and all that sort of thing. I think it's really honestly just more about political expediency of like, what did Trudeau inherit and how is he leaving it now? So first thing, right?
Yeah.
And I know a lot of the attention has focused very much on the head count, right?
Yeah.
Of like sort of full time equivalents,
Head
recognizing.
count, but also the per capita number as well.
Yes, I have seen some of that too, and that actually those two things tell slightly different stories, right? That
Yeah.
actually the head count rate in terms of just count up the number of people who are occupying jobs within the federal public service that has risen. That those measures never usually break down. Are they actually full-time permanent employees, right? Or are these people who have actually been hired on, say, a contract basis to deliver
Yeah.
something on a temporary basis without the sort of the promise of ongoing long-term employment? On the per capita basis, what you see instead is that actually the rest of Canada has also increased significantly, right? Like we're now a
Yeah.
country of 41 million people, and so on a per capita share, actually, it hasn't grown that much. I actually prefer measures that are slightly different. So number one, you can think about like how big is government in terms of if you take all government spending, what share of the economy does that account for?
Mhm.
On that, yeah, it did grow a bit, but not extraordinarily. Like we're talking about 14-ish% under Stephen Harper, a little over 14% under Stephen Harper when he leaves office. And now it's like 16%. So it's like a 2% bump in terms of share of GDP. But that's not about necessarily about spending on public servants. That's about all of the spending that
Yeah.
government
That
does,
they
right?
that they ostensibly administer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you look at that, this is the part I find super interesting. When you add up, okay, government takes in all this money and it sends it out, and you can kind of think about that as like governments tell you what's important to them by looking at how they allocate their overall budget. And on that basis, actually, the share of total federal spending that goes to people's salaries, benefits, pensions, blah, 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 is significantly smaller today than it was when Stephen Harper was last in office. So Stephen Harper
Huh.
leads it, and it's about 14% of the federal budget goes to cover salaries, wages, overtime, benefits, yada, yada. The most recent number that we have for the end of the Trudeau era says it's a little under 11% now.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
you've
and
got
that's
bigger
not something
government, but
you
not people.
ever hear about in terms of, the people who are complaining about the growth and the size of government. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I think there's also been attention to, oh, well, maybe it's because they're hiring a bunch of contractors. It turns out actually as a share of spending there, it didn't change. So it was the same portion of the federal budget going to those outside contractors to come in, and deliver services to government. Um, Same under Harper as it was at the tail end of the Trudeau era.
hmm,
Yeah.
that's very interesting. And it kind of problematizes that narrative a little bit too. So,
Yeah. Yeah. The way that I think about this is like, okay, government did get bigger, right? Went from 14 to like a little over 16% of GDP, but it didn't get bigger in terms of the back end of government getting significantly bigger. It's like government did more that went out into the real world. And yeah, there are some more, like on a headcount basis, yes, there are some more public servants, but as a share of like what is government spending on itself versus what is government spending out in the real world,
Hmm.
very different kinds of pictures.
Yeah. All right. Well, the flip side of this notion that government is too big are the people who are talking about, program reviews or deficit reduction action plans. That was Harper's acronym. But now we're getting this whole thing about DOGE coming in from up in the from the States, and we have some conservative thinkers, and I use the term loosely, saying that we need something similar in this country, and going so far as to even say, "Oh, well, we need Toby to do it instead of Elon." And my head breaks a little bit when I hear these things. But again, you wrote a really interesting piece on comparing the '90s program review to the DOGE. I'm not sure what we're going to call it, debacle, gong show, something like that. For viewers, I'm going to link that piece down in the description. But tell me a little bit about how we're conceiving about these things in comparison to one another.
Okay. Oh my goodness, where do we even begin? Okay, so let me just start off with the obvious. DOGE is dodgy, right?
Yeah.
Like what they are doing down there in the States is dodgy. I've lost track of the number of court battles now, where basically it's pretty clear that the efforts of this one small office of the executive branch has usurped the role and the authorities of Congress, their legislative branch.
Yeah.
They are cutting jobs willy-nilly and then realizing after the fact that, oh, maybe you actually do need people who are in charge of nuclear safety and avian flu in the middle of a bird flu epidemic. But they're unable to actually get back in touch with people because they've already shut off their computer access and turned off their emails. The receipts page that they are maintaining as their one and only public accountability. I want to be really clear on this. Like that is their only method of actually providing any transparency and accountability to American taxpayers. First of all, it is a site that has been hacked multiple times because the code is so sloppy. Really, really encouraging, isn't it? And second of all, it is a weird rotating cast of now you see it, now you don't, where a claim for having saved money for a program goes up. They have inflated it in some cases by a factor of 1,000. And then had to correct that. In other cases, they've realized, oh, actually, we put up a receipt for having canceled a program. It was just actually that the contract ended, so we didn't really save money. All kinds of things here. The other part too is that while Elon is very clearly the face, right, and taking all of the credit, Elon Musk is taking the credit for this initiative, and you can certainly see in terms of any information that's been made available as to who exactly is working on this and who is involved and in what places. In many cases, these are folks who have had some sort of previous tie to Elon in one or more of his businesses. Elon, in fact, according to court filings by the U.S. government, has no official role in DOGE.
Right.
That it is another person who is the official administrator. And again, so you have this problem, right, of transparency. What is the legal basis and authorities on which they are operating? Accountability for their decisions and their actions. And all of this is lacking. And I think, that the reason that we care about accountability, the reason we care about transparency is so that in democracy, people maintain trust in their institutions.
Yeah.
And I think you're already starting to see some of the consequences of the lack of trust in terms of what's going on with Tesla stock, because that's the one place that the market can start to show its declining trust. Okay, so that's DOGE.
That's DOGE.
Program review. And I mean, you can see there's so much you want to avoid. Much you want to avoid, right?
Yeah.
So program review. Okay. program review. And I'm going to contrast program review a little bit with exercises like DRAP and then also sort of cyclical spending reviews that had been a little bit in vogue for a while there. I also want to preface this all by saying I actually do think we need program review. I genuinely do. And I think that there are things where the government is spending too much on some areas and it is too big in some areas and is doing things that are just terribly inefficient and really not fit for purpose anymore. But how you go about identifying those and dealing with them really matters. Like process matters here.
The process is often the question.
Yeah, 100%. Process, transparency, accountability, following the laws, part of democracy. So program review in the 1990s, for anybody who would like to read up more on this, Jocelyn Bourgon, who was the clerk of the Privy Council at the time, has written a fantastic piece on it, published by CG and the Institute on, I always get this wrong, Institute for Government, the UK think tank. We have the Institute on, they have the Institute for. Okay. Anyway, Google it. I think it's also linked in the, or I've embedded a link in the piece that I wrote. So that was a serious exercise. That was I also motivated by a profound fiscal crisis that was facing the country. Yeah. But interestingly, they didn't set a priority. They did not set a particular target for it. It wasn't sort of like we are going to do a 15% spending reduction. We are going to reduce the size of the public service by half. They didn't do that. Instead, it was more of an approach of saying we need to take a functional reassessment here of everything that government at the federal level is doing and ask ourselves, should we keep doing this? If somebody needs to keep doing this, is it for sure that it should be us as the federal government, or is there a comparative advantage of basically devolving this to provinces and territories, or of having the delivery of this good or service outsourced either through private sector or through the voluntary sector? And they took their time. So if you actually follow the bouncing ball of the budgets, the first budget that the Liberal government at the time, this was the Chrétien government, the first budget that they came in with was not a slash and burn budget, right? It was sort of a like steady state, almost no new spending at all, but no major spending reductions, like one or two kind of adjustments at the margins, because they needed the time to actually go through carefully the entire system. And they had a minister that was appointed who could be the point person to answer questions in Parliament. There was a process through the regular cabinet system to ensure that all cabinet ministers were engaged, whereas in the States, you look and you find out like Marco Rubio was pissed off at Elon Musk because a bunch of his programs got cut, and Secretary of Transportation or whoever else is like angry because a whole bunch of his employees got cut without even being consulted. That didn't happen.
It's a bunch of air traffic controllers got cut.
That didn't happen here, right? Ministers were actively involved and accountable for the program review exercises within their own departments. Now, of course, like there's obviously a bit of a not in my backyard dynamic, right? But by basically forcing the issue, by ensuring that you also have a prime minister and a finance minister who are aligned on the importance here of having senior people, the minister in charge, who, by the way, had also been a public servant, so like kind of knew the ins and outs of how the systems work. Having a clerk who was on board, like you discipline the system, right? So that ministers were not able to sort of say, oh, don't cut me, please. And it worked, right? Like it took time, but basically over the course of about 2 to 3 budget cycles, you start to see a situation where the federal government returns to being able to project a surplus. And then we were in surpluses for quite some time. So it worked. That's if you care specifically just about the fiscal picture. I think we actually also need to care about the shape, form, and function of the institution of the public service. We're facing like really, really big, serious problems in our country right now, like existential threats, right? So we need a public service. We need instruments of government that are actually going to have new kinds of capacities to be able to respond to that. So my view is that a program review may or may not result in significant reductions to government spending, but it should result in really important reallocations of government effort and spending and resources that are more fit for purpose and more aligned with what the country actually is going to need going forward.
I would imagine efficiency is probably one of the outcomes of this as well, because you're able to find places where things aren't working in the best manner possible, or people are allocated improperly in this kind to certain programs, and that would be a good way of trying to actually deal with some of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, look, a simplified way that we often think about efficiency is like do more with less. Right? But actually, when you're thinking about core essential functions, like you need a state, you need a high functioning state that can do this. Efficiency should actually mean you have the most optimal allocation of resources to get the best performance possible. And in some cases, that might actually mean increasing the resources allocated to get better performance, right?
Yeah.
I read another thing that was basically a pitch for here are three things that government could do, and I'll just mention one of them right now in terms of like spaces to look to find efficiencies. The reporting burden. Oh my God, the reporting burden. Like Treasury Board alone has 51 separate reporting requirements across the public service that all operate on a slightly different cycle. There's also on top of that, there's been a massive increase in terms of the reporting requirements for every single policy initiative that might be considered by cabinet and then again by the Treasury Board. There's a massive increase in terms of the reporting burden on individual public servants in terms of performance, presence in the office, and like all of these things have come in at different times for different reasons. I'm sorry, I could go through like it would spend half an hour if I just listed all of these, but all of this to say, like each of these comes in and it's like a layer of sediment, right? And we never stop to sort of say, do we still need the reporting on that thing?
Yeah. And oftentimes the reporting comes in after some kind of problem or scandal, and we don't think about the overall picture. We just think, oh, we need more reports in order to deal with whatever that issue was.
And I think, yeah, absolutely, right? It was like, let's deal retrospectively with the problem that we had the one time by forever now committing to doing a thing without taking account of what is the cost to now engage in this new activity. Like, I think there's sometimes a perception that like government has this like super database, and there's like a guy in the control room who can, if he just puts in the right buttons, it'll spit out the right information. And it's like, oh my God, no, it is like a series of disconnected databases that don't speak to each other, that are clunky, that are old, that in some cases are falling apart. And so every time you think about a reporting burden, like we always fail to ask, what is the cost relative to the value of this new reporting requirement that we're going to put in? Because it's going to take people to manually go through the systems and create the report that you're asking for. Yeah. So anyway, there's one efficiency area that we could and should really seriously look at.
For sure. One other thing, it's one of these kinds of things that comes up every time there's a program review or so on, is the so-called musical ride problem.
Yes.
And for viewers who aren't aware, this was the notion that the RCMP were told they needed to find certain savings, and they came back and said, well, the only thing we can cut is the musical ride, which is anathema for any government to cut. In order to try and kind of bully their way into avoiding any kind of cuts. How does a government deal with these kinds of tactics?
Yeah. The musical ride problem is a great illustrative example. There are others too. Like, for example, some of your viewers may remember for a period of time, the Experimental Lakes area which is like a international treasure in
Yeah.
terms of science and government funded research that helps us understand a whole bunch of things in terms of climate change, water safety, biodiversity, on and on and on. It lost its funding. Same issue as the musical ride, right? It's sort of this idea of if you establish a target, if you say, find me, 20 pounds of flesh that we can cut, then the public service, if you have set this up as a contest, right?
Yeah.
I think you're hiding stuff from me. You're going to have to offer up things for me to cut, but I don't trust you. Then you set up this dynamic, a competitive dynamic, where the public servants then are incentivized to offer up things that are politically incredibly costly to cut as a bargaining tool, so that the actual incidence of the cuts or the volume of the cuts will be smaller. That's if you set it up as this competitive low trust game.
Right.
So how do you avoid that? You engage the public servants in a meaningful process that is actually also about number one, you don't fire people willy-nilly, right? You
Yeah.
follow like the rules and labor laws and your collective agreements. You treat people with dignity and respect. Number two, you also focus on what are the things, public servants, that you are currently doing that if you could do less of that, you would be able to deliver better value to Canadians, right? And
Yeah.
so that's more of what I think would be a meaningful and useful conversation, as opposed to the let's set a target but engage in a competitive bargaining where the 20 pounds of flesh is stuff that I won't want to have to cut.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that takes time, right?
Yeah.
That takes
No,
time.
for sure.
Yeah.
And this is kind of what I worry about as we start transitioning to a new ministry right now is how much the new regime is going to take these things into consideration.
Well, I mean, look, they are in a sense kind of, I mean, look, our system is such that he doesn't have a seat in the House. He hasn't tested the confidence of the House and so forth.
Yeah.
So, but he is Carney is the Prime Minister designate and will be sworn in and has the full rights and responsibilities of a Prime Minister in terms of a head of government. But it sounds like we're going to be headed into an election pretty soon. And that means that there's sort of this caretaker model of
Yeah.
don't make big changes, right? Deal with crises.
Yeah.
In consultation with the opposition. It would be really helpful if the opposition could be read in and have security clearance. That's another issue.
Yes.
Yes. Just if anything were to happen during the caretaker period, it might be useful. So I don't expect that they will actually come in, I don't see them swinging Malay's chainsaw over their heads the way that Elon
Right.
Musk was doing performatively. So I think the big question will be whoever forms government after the next election. What are the aims and objectives that they set? What is the process that they put in place? How are they going to be accountable and transparent with Parliament and therefore with Canadians about what it is that they are doing and cutting? That's the part that I will be keeping an eye on.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay. Sounds great.
All right.
Thanks.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.